Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Engin and the organisers of the research project for inviting me to speak here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to think about these issues and to present research which is at the moment still very much research in progress to you. Is that okay? Citizenship, I want to argue, is not only to be understood in terms of abstract categories and the contemporary struggles to achieve it, but also in terms of the historical narratives that frame its conceptualization. As Engin and others have suggested, ideas of citizenship frequently trace an intellectual genealogy to the ancient city-states of Greece and Rome and describe its modern realization in European and North American histories. I want to add, however, that the positive articulation of citizenship through an analysis of these events runs the risk of simplifying the historical narrative and doesn't often give an adequate account of the exclusions that were also constitutive of those narratives and how they matter conceptually. As I'll go on to argue, these exclusions were not simply significant in terms of providing the binary opposite of identities based on citizenship, but were structurally significant in the constitution of understandings of citizenship that continue to operate in the contemporary world. As such, to understand citizenship, we have to address these exclusions as structural. The force of Said's critique of Orientalism has been to point to the historical entanglements that were continuously effaced in the construction of the Orient. But this critique can also be pointed at other instances where explanations seek to account for difference in endogenous terms. For example, in Europe's creation of modernity out of its feudal past, as opposed to accounting for it as a consequence of the connected histories and connected sociologies of inclusion and exclusion. In this presentation, I take the ideas which underlie Said's specific account of Orientalism, and I use them to think through the histories of indigeneity and settler colonialism as constituting the wider context for the emergence of ideas and practices of modern citizenship. Ultimately, my interest in this is in examining the history of the United States as a European projection, and therefore to bring the analysis of the United States home to Europe to understand the relation of its own account of modern citizenship, not merely in relation to its feudal past, but also to its wider colonial past and post-colonial present. While the central question in debates on citizenship, as Engin suggests, has often been who is the citizen, it needs, he argues, to move also to address what makes the citizen. Citizenship in this context is posited as a performative act by subjects who claim the right to have rights, and as an institution constituted through those performances. By making citizenship performative, however, and seeking to understand it in these terms, a number of underlying assumptions are brought into the analysis that I would suggest require further scrutiny. This succinct claim, for example, presumes the existence of two domains, a political domain and a non-political domain, and it suggests that it's through struggles for citizenship that people move from the non-political domain to the political one. This assumes that people outside of citizenship are not political, and that being outside of citizenship is not itself already politically constituted. The definition of modern citizenship utilised here makes invisible the processes by way of which political privilege has become entrenched and regularised as the norm against which other processes are then to be measured and accorded or not the status of citizen or the status of political. It further creates the necessity for struggles to draw upon the very categories that perform the initial exclusion. This making invisible, as I'll go on to suggest, occurs as a consequence of our abstraction of the conceptual category of modern citizenship from the circumstances in which it was initially articulated. Circumstances in which citizenship was seen to be a justification of inequality as opposed to a resolution of inequality. Thus, Modern citizenship is seen to emerge in the context of the development of the subject capable of property, as Hegel has put it, and the ideas of membership with its attendant inclusions and exclusions of the nation-state. It's further defined against two other understandings of the subject incapable of property and the subject indifferent to property. Within the first definition, some subjects are denied citizenship because they're not free of the dictates of subsistence. This includes men without property and women and children. Some are denied it because they're regarded as lacking in the quality of being a reasoning subject, women and children. Others, more significantly, are denied it as a consequence of the institution of chattel slavery, which combines both these reasons and further treats those subjected to it as the objects or property of others. The second definition, the subject indifferent to property, is that of the subject who does not recognise the individuated property, the inhabitants of lands that Europeans wish to occupy and appropriate, that is, to take into individual ownership. The modern European subject is defined in terms of self-ownership in the context of wider discourses of emancipation and equality, and located in the context of practices of taking others into ownership and appropriating their means of subsistence and reproduction. The others not only stand outside of standard understandings of the modern subject epistemologically, but their outsider position is itself a consequence of historical actions undertaken by European subjects as the expression of their own modern subjectivity. Both of these groups come together in the US, and the original "we the people" excludes both of them from the "we" that is regarded as constitutive of modern citizenship. Their inclusion, then, would require an address of the initial exclusionary moment, both conceptually and materially, and a proper inclusion would necessarily be transformative. The simple seductive phrase, "we the people," however, effaces a complex history that few scholars have adequately addressed in their intellectual genealogies of modern citizenship as a conceptual category. The celebratory and exceptionalist rhetoric associated with the founding of the United States is often traced to Tocqueville's classic 1835 study, Democracy in America. In this, Tocqueville provides a comparative sociology of the institutions of democracy and citizenship in the US, and his depiction of the vibrancy of institutions and political culture there is pointedly contrasted with the traditional hierarchy and outmoded forms found within France, notwithstanding its own recent revolutionary history. The fact that the US is a new nation, Tocqueville suggests, means that it's able to forge its own destiny, free of the encumbrances of history and tradition that continue to inflect the European forms. As such, it seemed to embody a particular form of modernity, one that is purified from the residues of Europe's feudal past. As Locke says, for example, "In the beginning all was America, and the future shall be America." It seemed not only to demonstrate the promise for emancipation, regarded as inherent to modernity, but also to be the first lived expression of this modern form of politics and citizenship. It is the latter analytical point in particular that has contributed to Tocqueville's study becoming central to the self-understanding of the US as a democratic nation and to subsequent scholarly engagements with his work around the idea of political citizenship. Very few, however, have gone on to address Tocqueville's other significant claim that's made within this work, namely that the land of the United States is occupied by three races, and that his account of democracy is primarily only about one of them. And that's because the history of the other two is of their subjugation by the very institutions and practices that are otherwise being praised. Tocqueville's account of democracy and citizenship in America cannot be adequately appraised or utilised without also taking into account his analysis of the deficiencies of both as seen from the perspective of the two races usually excluded from such discussion, and to quote, the Indians and the Negroes. Both groups, he writes, quote, suffer the effects of tyranny, and though their afflictions are different, they have the same people to blame for them, end of quote. Tocqueville's celebration of US democracy, in particular the equality of conditions that gave rise to its modern form of citizenship, is tempered by his observation of the treatment of Indians and Negroes at the hands of these democratic Europeans. However, the complexity of social relations to which Tocqueville points is rarely addressed by subsequent scholars in their own examinations of democracy and citizenship. And what is usually silenced is the domination upon which modern forms of citizenship are founded. The transformation of the continent into the United States of America occurred through the historical processes of dispossession, displacement, enslavement, and domination. Historical processes that have rarely entered into mainstream considerations of the emergence and development of political citizenship there. The standard narrative moves from depictions of a white settler society, establishing modes of democratic participation through the struggle for colonial independence and freedom, to that of a migrant society in which all are able to strive for the American dream. The two groups, however, which cannot partake of the founding rhetoric of independence as constituting the moment of freedom, or the subsequent narrative of achieving the American dream through an identity based on immigration, are Black Americans, Africans brought over in a condition of slavery and servitude, which continued long after national independence and those early struggles for freedom and democracy from which they were excluded, and Native Americans, the displaced and dispossessed earlier inhabitants of that continent. Both of these groups are out of place in the standard narratives, and their displacement, both material and epistemological, is what is at issue here. The subsequent narrative of political citizenship within the United States is one of gradual inclusion and the creation of a more perfect union. This indeed was the focus of one of Barack Obama's speeches while on the campaign trail for the US presidency in 2008. In it, he recognized that the Constitution, and here I'm quoting, was stained by this nation's original sin of slavery. But he argued forcefully that, to continue the quote, the answer to the slavery question was already embedded within our Constitution, a Constitution that had at its core the ideal of equal citizenship under the law, a Constitution that promised its people liberty and justice in a union that could and should be perfected over time, end of quote. The implication of this is that the union, including its exclusions, was perfect, but that it could also be made more perfect, that is, include those who had been excluded, by using the very resource, that is, the Constitution, which itself regarded enslavement as not incompatible with perfection. Indeed, the rhetoric of the contemporary Tea Party movement in the United States calls for a return to the original perfect Constitution and seeks to take back America, with the barely disguised racist implication being take back America from a Black president. And for those, if any of you heard the comments made by Pat Buchanan and Bill O'Reilly and others about the re-election of Obama and how this was no longer America, i.e. this was not white America, and the problem was that there were all these other people who now wanted things. You just sort of think, well, you know, what is the deeper narrative that's coming out of? So given the central role played by the Constitution in the identity of the United States and of its citizens, the call for gradual inclusivity leaves some space for citizenship to be determined by the original exclusionary definition. Refusing to interrogate what equality and citizenship meant at the time in terms of the lived expression of these conceptual categories perpetuates those very inequalities. And just to add, alongside the enslavement of a people, there was another historical process which could equally be considered as constituting this nation's original sin, and that is the displacement and dispossession of the earlier inhabitants of the continent. So to conclude then, given that our dominant understandings of citizenship see it as a mechanism for producing inclusion, we fail to understand its beginnings as an institution fundamentally based on exclusion. As a consequence, those who are excluded are doubly disavowed. Their exclusion is not properly acknowledged at the point of emergence, and the continuation of that exclusion is in the context of the resources that citizenship provides, is often seen as an aspect of their own flawed subjectivity or their lack of modernity. They are made responsible for their exclusion, and those who seek to be included are validated as political, and those who do not are regarded as flawed and/or non-modern subjects. What is missed in such analyses is the pre-existing political frame that organises actors as being political or non-political, included or excluded. It's only by recognising enslavement and dispossession as constitutive aspects of the polity that is the United States of America, and the legacies of such practices, that the legacies of such practices can be adequately addressed in the present. To the extent that such practices and the people to whom they relate are excluded from canonical statements pertaining to the history of the United States, the injustices emanating from them will continue to exist. Injustices evidenced by the continuing and severe racial gaps in almost every dimension of social, economic, and political life within the United States. The injustices of displacement, dispossession, enslavement, and domination are not, and have not been, overcome by simply extending equal citizenship to those who were previously excluded from it and subjugated by it. Citizenship itself needs to be rethought in the context of its wider history and new forms developed from those reconstructed histories. Thank you.